Hollywood has always had rules, but midnight movies were born to smash them. These weren't polite dramas or glossy blockbusters. They were strange, raw, and often downright offensive to the censors. They pushed boundaries so far that entire audiences gasped, laughed, or walked out in shock. But which films tore the rulebook into shreds and rewrote what cinema could be? Buckle in, because the following titles didn't just break rules, they destroyed them. Pink Flamingos, 1972. How do you even begin to describe Pink Flamingos? Imagine a film so outrageous that theaters refused to screen it. Critics begged people not to watch it, and yet crowds lined up at midnight just to see how far John Waters could go. Shot on a shoestring budget, it's a carnival of deliberately offensive scenes, starring Waters' muse Divine in a role that would forever redefine underground cinema. Censors hated everything about this movie. It wasn't just a matter of strong content, it was the way it shoved its outrageousness in your face without apology. Cities like Toronto and some across the US banned it outright. But for audiences tired of the sanitized world of studio cinema, this was rebellion on film. People didn't just watch Pink Flamingos, they bragged about surviving it. Waters leaned into the chaos, branding it an exercise in poor taste and marketing it with sly confidence. That was genius. What the censors wanted to bury, audiences resurrected as legend. Midnight screenings turned into rites of passage, where laughter mixed with groans, and shock became a badge of honor. The result? Pink Flamingos didn't just break censorship rules, it made those rules look irrelevant. It wasn't about whether the film was good, it was about daring to sit through it, daring to admit you had seen it, and daring to embrace the weird. El Topo, 1970. When Alejandro Jodorowsky's El Topo arrived in America, no one knew what to do with it. On the surface, it was a Western with cowboys, duels, and dusty deserts. But within minutes, it unraveled into something else entirely. A hallucinatory journey filled with violent imagery, surreal visions, and symbolism so heavy-handed that it baffled critics and audiences alike. It didn't pass through the MPAA the way normal films did. Instead, it slipped into late-night screenings in New York's Elgin Theater, becoming one of the very first true midnight movies. The censors hated its violence, its strange spiritual undertones, and its grotesque imagery. But audiences? They ate it up. The film became a cult obsession, drawing celebrities like John Lennon and Yoko Ono to packed midnight showings. Lennon was so fascinated he helped finance Jodorowsky's next movie. The wildest part is how El Topo rejected storytelling convention. Traditional Westerns followed a code. Good versus evil. Order versus chaos. Jodorowsky blew that apart. His gunslinger wasn't a hero. He was a violent, wandering figure, spiraling deeper into madness. Censors couldn't ban it because it wasn't distributed in the usual way, but they couldn't control its growing legend either. In the end, El Topo broke censorship rules not through open defiance, but through sheer strangeness. It was too bizarre to censor cleanly, too surreal to fit into boxes, and too unforgettable to vanish. Midnight movies weren't just about pushing limits, they were about creating entirely new worlds, and El Topo lit that fuse. Eraserhead, 1977. What happens when a movie is so strange, so disturbing, that the censors don't even know where to begin? You get David Lynch's Eraserhead. Shot over several years with scraps of money and sheer determination, it defied every normal standard of cinema. The film is a bleak industrial nightmare, where the sound design alone is enough to rattle your nerves, and the visuals haunt you long after the credits. The MPAA didn't even rate it at first. How could they? What box do you put a movie in when it doesn't fit any category? Too disturbing for a regular release, Eraserhead thrived in the midnight scene. Audiences stumbled out of screenings pale and shaken, unsure if they'd seen art or madness. Censors traditionally had a checklist: too much violence, too much intimacy, too many taboo themes. Eraserhead avoided those exact categories but still terrified people. Its disturbing imagery wasn't about shock value, it was about atmosphere, dread, and alienation. Yet in doing so, it broke the unwritten rule that movies should be watchable in a conventional sense. The result? It became a cult masterpiece. Lynch's twisted visuals and eerie sound design forced the world to accept that sometimes breaking rules doesn't mean going louder. It means getting stranger. The censors couldn't fight it because they couldn't define it. And that, ironically, was the most powerful rule it broke. The rule that films have to make sense. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975. If you told the MPAA in 1975 that one of the most ridiculed musicals of the decade would become the most famous midnight movie of all time, they'd have laughed in your face. But that's exactly what happened with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Initially, it bombed. Mainstream audiences didn't know what to make of a film that mixed gothic horror with glam rock, outrageous costumes, and wall-to-wall camp. Censors flagged its innuendos and flamboyance, but by the time midnight screenings started rolling, none of that mattered. Fans turned the film into an interactive experience, shouting lines, dressing up, and singing along until it became less of a movie and more of a ritual. Censorship lost its grip because the community around Rocky Horror was bigger than the rules. It was never just about what was on the screen, it was about what happened in the theater. The movie gave audiences permission to let loose, mock the system, and celebrate the very things the censors had tried to control. The wildest irony? The film that broke rules and horrified critics became the longest-running theatrical release in history. To this day, theaters across the world still screen it at midnight, proving that sometimes the most offensive films outlive the safe ones. Rocky Horror wasn't just a movie, it was a movement. Freaks, 1932. Decades before midnight movies were a thing, Todd Browning's Freaks horrified censors in a way few films ever have. Made in 1932, it was banned in multiple states and countries for one simple reason. It used real circus performers with physical differences as its cast. Critics at the time called it grotesque, and MGM tried to bury it after audiences fainted during early screenings. For years, the film was nearly impossible to find. But when it resurfaced in the 1960s and 70s, it found new life as a midnight sensation. Audiences weren't shocked in the same way anymore. Instead, they saw it as a raw, unflinching rejection of Hollywood's polished illusions. The very thing censors hated became its greatest strength. The story itself was bold enough. A tale of love, betrayal, and revenge among circus performers. It ended with a finale so unsettling that MGM cut it down, terrified of public outrage. Even in its shorter form, it was still too much for 1930s audiences. By the time it came back, decades later, its reputation as the movie too shocking to show guaranteed its place in the midnight canon. Freaks proved that censorship might silence a film for a while, but if the story is strong enough, it will eventually claw its way back to the screen. And when it does, the shock is even more powerful. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. When Tobe Hooper unleashed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on the world, censors practically had a meltdown. Here was a low-budget horror film shot in the sweltering Texas heat, featuring screaming victims, a buzzing chainsaw, and one of the most terrifying villains ever put on film, Leatherface. But what really rattled censors wasn't the gore, it was the suggestion of it. Contrary to its reputation, the movie doesn't actually show endless blood and guts. What it does is far more disturbing. Hooper's relentless direction, the constant whine of the chainsaw, and the claustrophobic atmosphere convinced viewers they were watching something more graphic than it really was. And that trick infuriated censors. They couldn't point to specific shots as too much, but the intensity alone pushed them to nearly slap it with an X rating. In Britain, it was outright banned for years. In the US, it slipped into midnight circuits, where its grainy realism only added to the legend. The film felt less like entertainment and more like found footage of a nightmare you weren't supposed to see. Audiences staggered out shell-shocked, while word of mouth spread like wildfire. Texas Chainsaw broke the Fixator A. Rules by proving you didn't need to show everything to horrify people. It blurred the line between exploitation and art, forcing the MPAA to face the fact that atmosphere could be just as offensive as visuals. For censors, that was uncharted territory. For horror fans, it was a masterpiece. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. George Romero didn't set out to create a midnight legend. He just wanted to make a low-budget horror film. But when Night of the Living Dead premiered, it did more than terrify audiences. It completely broke the mold. Released without an MPAA rating, it bypassed censorship entirely. That loophole meant kids, teens, and adults all crowded into theaters expecting a fun monster flick. What they got instead was a grim, violent, no-hope story. For 1968, the level of on-screen brutality was unheard of. Audiences gasped at scenes of flesh-eating ghouls, and parents were outraged that their children had seen such horrors. Critics called it a disgrace, but the Midnight Circuit embraced it. By ignoring the usual rules, Romero not only shocked censors but also set the template for the modern zombie movie. And then came the ending. Without spoiling, let's just say it flipped the hero trope upside down, leaving audiences stunned into silence. That bold move broke more than censorship codes, it broke narrative expectations. Censors were furious, but they were also powerless. The film's raw, black and white visuals made it feel like a newsreel from the apocalypse, too real to ignore. By the time censors tried to clamp down, the movie had already gained cult momentum. In the end, Night of the Living Dead didn't just bend the rules, it rewrote them. Horror was never the same again. The Last House on the Left, 1972. When Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left hit theaters, it didn't just upset censors, it enraged them. Billed with the infamous tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie." This raw, disturbing story of crime and revenge went further than most audiences were prepared to handle. Censors hacked away at it with scissors, but no matter how many cuts they demanded, the impact remained. The film's handheld camera work gave it a rough, almost documentary feel, which made everything look terrifyingly real. For viewers, that made the violence harder to dismiss as just a movie. For censors, it was a nightmare. They didn't just see a horror flick, they saw a challenge to the very boundaries of what films should show. The movie ended up banned or heavily edited in dozens of regions. In the US, it survived mostly in midnight screenings, where its reputation grew. Fans whispered about the uncut versions, and curiosity turned into obsession. It became less about the story and more about the experience of surviving it. What made it rule-breaking wasn't just its intensity, it was how openly it flaunted censorship. The tagline itself mocked censors, daring audiences to test their limits. Midnight movie fans lived for that kind of audacity. And The Last House on the Left delivered. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Stanley Kubrick was never one to play by the rules, but with A Clockwork Orange, he ignited one of the fiercest censorship battles in cinema history. Based on Anthony Burgess's novel, the film presented a future dripping with violence, strange slang, and biting satire. Censors zeroed in on its unflinching depictions of cruelty and its dark humor, which they claimed glorified lawlessness. In the US, the MPAA barely let it pass with an R, while several countries slapped bans on it altogether. Midnight screenings became the place to see it uncut, where audiences leaned into its hypnotic imagery and bizarre energy. For some, it was disturbing beyond belief. For others, it was a groundbreaking piece of art. What rattled censors most wasn't just the violent scenes, it was Kubrick's refusal to condemn his anti-hero outright. The film dared audiences to grapple with questions about morality, control, and free will instead of feeding them easy answers. That was a direct violation of the unwritten censorship rule. Movies must guide you to the right conclusion. By the end, A Clockwork Orange didn't just survive censorship, it used the outrage to fuel its legend. Midnight audiences embraced it as both a visual masterpiece and a cultural dare. To this day, it remains a lightning rod. A film that's both celebrated and attacked in equal measure. The Grandmother, 1970. Before Eraserhead, David Lynch made a short film that was so strange and unsettling, it wound up sneaking into midnight bills. The Grandmother. Made with a grant from the American Film Institute, it blended animation, live action, and surreal sound design to tell the story of a neglected boy who literally grows his own grandmother. Censors didn't know what to do with it. Was it a student film? An art piece? A horror experiment? It defied every category, making it impossible to rate or regulate. Yet when paired with midnight screenings of Lynch's later work, it gained a cult following all its own. Audiences found it haunting, grotesque, and oddly tender all at once. What broke the rules here was the sheer gall of showing such a bizarre vision in theaters at all. Hollywood was built on polished productions, but the grandmother looked handmade, intimate, and deeply unsettling. By giving it space on the midnight circuit, programmers thumbed their noses at traditional censorship. If movies were supposed to be neat, clean, and safe, this one proudly shouted, "Not anymore." For Lynch, it was the first step toward becoming one of cinema's most daring directors. For midnight audiences, it was proof that even a 30-minute film could terrify censors and thrill fans. Glen or Glenda, 1953. Most people know Ed Wood as the so-called worst director of all time, but in Glen or Glenda, he broke rules in ways that were decades ahead of their time. The movie, framed as an exploitation piece, was really Wood's personal plea for understanding. Shot fast and cheap, it used dream sequences, wild cutaways, and stiff narration to explore identity in ways Hollywood never dared touch. Censors were not amused. In the 1950s, this kind of subject matter was absolutely taboo, and the film was dismissed as shocking, weird, and dangerous. Many theaters flat out refused to show it, yet when midnight movies became a thing in the 1970s, Glen or Glenda found a new audience. Fans didn't just watch it for its unintentional comedy. They recognized it as a groundbreaking attempt to push cinema where it wasn't allowed to go. What made it rule-breaking was its very existence. Hollywood censorship in the 1950s was so rigid that simply putting certain topics on film was considered scandalous. Wood's clumsy but daring choice turned his movie into a midnight treasure. It proved that even so-called bad films could challenge authority, and sometimes that's what made them unforgettable. Blood Feast, 1963. Herschel Gordon Lewis never pretended Blood Feast was classy. It was a carnival of over-the-top violence, proudly advertising itself as nothing so appalling in the annals of horror. For 1963, it was shocking beyond belief. Limbs were hacked, blood spilled everywhere, and the censors absolutely panicked. Traditional horror of the early 60s was all suggestion, shadows, eerie music, a scream in the dark. Lewis tossed that playbook in the trash. He showed everything, turning his film into a crude, relentless spectacle. Theaters in small towns freaked out, and many tried to block it from playing. But at midnight screenings, it became legendary. Fans couldn't believe a movie like this even existed. Critics mocked it as trash, but Lewis laughed all the way to the bank. He had tapped into something censors didn't understand. Audiences wanted more. They wanted boundaries broken, taboos shattered, and Blood Feast gave it to them in raw form. Midnight showings transformed this grindhouse cheapie into a cornerstone of horror history. The censors couldn't stop it because Lewis distributed it independently, outside the usual Hollywood system. By the time anyone realized how much it scared them, the film had already written itself into the cult canon. Polyester, 1981. By the time John Waters made Polyester, he was already the king of shocking midnight fare. But here, instead of pushing gore or offensive gags, he turned his energy into parody, and he used a gimmick that drove censors crazy. Odorama. Audiences at screenings were handed scratch and sniff cards, each numbered. At certain points, they scratched the card and got a scent tied to the film, some pleasant, some revolting. The idea was pure mischief. Not only were you watching a John Waters movie, you were literally smelling it too. Censors hated the trick because it made them irrelevant. How do you censor a smell? How do you regulate a gag that jumps off the screen and into the audience's hands? You don't. That was the brilliance. The film itself was a satire of soap operas, starring Divine in a surprisingly emotional role. Waters toned down some of his earlier shock tactics, but the Odorama stunt guaranteed that Polyester would never be mistaken for a normal release. At midnight screenings, the laughter and groans echoed as audiences scratched their cards in unison, creating a shared rebellion against the idea that movies should be clean experiences. Polyester proved that breaking rules didn't always mean going darker. It could also mean mocking the very idea of censorship. And Waters did it with a smile. The Devils, 1971. Ken Russell's The Devils is still whispered about as one of the most censored films in history. Based loosely on historical events, it blended political corruption, hysteria, and shocking imagery into a film that terrified studios as much as it outraged critics. In the US, it was butchered before release, with entire sequences cut out for fear of backlash. But at midnight screenings, audiences caught glimpses of the raw power Russell originally intended. Even in censored form, it was too much for many viewers. The combination of graphic violence, disturbing set pieces, and manic performances made it feel like something audiences weren't supposed to see. Censors tried every trick, cuts, bans, edits, but the legend only grew. Fans whispered about the missing footage, fueling the movie's underground reputation. To this day, many scenes remain difficult to find, which only adds to its cult mystique. What makes The Devils truly rule-breaking is how far it went with style. Russell cranked everything to 11. Giant, surreal sets, frantic editing, and performances that felt possessed. It wasn't just shocking in content, it was shocking in sheer intensity. And for midnight audiences, that was the ultimate draw. Reefer Madness, 1936. Originally made as a scare film warning about the dangers of marijuana, Reefer Madness was dead serious when it debuted in 1936. But by the 1970s, it had been rediscovered, and audiences couldn't stop laughing. Its exaggerated performances, melodramatic warnings, and ridiculous scenarios turned it from moral propaganda into an unintentional comedy classic. The very thing that made it censor-approved in the 1930s, the exaggerated fear-mongering, made it a joke by the time midnight audiences embraced it. People shouted lines back at the screen, laughed at its outdated warnings, and turned it into an interactive experience long before Rocky Horror popularized the idea. Censors in the 30s had used films like this to scare audiences into conformity. Decades later, the tables had turned. The movie became a symbol of just how silly censorship could be, exposing how propaganda ages poorly once the cultural tide shifts. At midnight screenings, the laughter was thunderous and the irony was delicious. A film once meant to enforce rules ended up ridiculed as the ultimate rule breaker. Reefer Madness proved that sometimes the best way to rebel against censorship is simply to laugh in its face. Forbidden Zone, 1980. If there was ever a movie that looked like it crawled out of a fever dream, it's Richard Elfman's Forbidden Zone. Shot in stark black and white with splashes of surreal color, it wasn't just a film, it was a carnival of chaos. Audiences stumbling into midnight screenings were greeted with singing heads, bizarre set pieces made from cardboard, and an outrageous performance by the Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo, fronted by Danny Elfman in full devilish regalia. Censors didn't know how to process it. Was it comedy? Was it exploitation? Was it just too strange to exist? The mix of crude humor, wild sexuality, and cartoonish violence made it nearly impossible to categorize, which in censorship terms was terrifying. Some theaters refused to book it at all. Others slapped on adults-only warnings, unsure of what else to do. But for midnight audiences, that confusion was half the fun. The movie became a cult ritual where its anarchic spirit and homemade aesthetic felt like the ultimate middle finger to Hollywood polish. It didn't matter that critics dismissed it. Fans embraced its rule-breaking energy, quoting lines, dressing in costumes, and reveling in its sheer strangeness. What made Forbidden Zone such a rule-breaker was its refusal to care about coherence or acceptability. It wasn't trying to be safe, respectable, or even understandable. Instead, it turned cinema into an underground circus where anything could happen. That's why it thrives as a midnight legend. The very chaos censors feared is exactly what audiences came to celebrate. Liquid Sky, 1982. By the early 1980s, midnight movies were evolving, and Liquid Sky showed how far they could go. This neon-soaked indie took place in New York's underground art scene, mixing sci-fi with punk aesthetics and raw energy. The premise was wild, tiny aliens feeding off humans, all against the backdrop of downtown nightlife. Censors were baffled. The film's drug-heavy themes, graphic imagery, and refusal to follow storytelling conventions made it impossible to categorize. It wasn't a studio picture, and it wasn't a polished indie. It was something entirely new. And audiences loved it. Midnight screenings became events where fans dove into its strange colors, jagged editing, and hypnotic vibe. The film broke rules not just in content, but in form. Scenes stretched on with experimental flair. Dialogue felt raw and improvised, and the visuals were unlike anything in mainstream cinema at the time. For censors, it was unclassifiable, which in their eyes was almost worse than being offensive. What made it thrive, though, was its attitude. Liquid Sky wasn't interested in making you comfortable. It wanted to rattle you, confuse you, and leave you buzzing with its weird energy. Midnight audiences didn't just watch it, they absorbed it, making it one of the definitive cult films of the early 80s. In the end, Liquid Sky proved the midnight movie spirit was alive and mutating. It wasn't just about shocking censors anymore, it was about creating a new language of cinema, one the rule makers couldn't control. So there you have it. 17 films that didn't just bend the rules, they set them on fire. These midnight movies were strange, shocking, hilarious, terrifying, and unforgettable. But above all, they proved that cinema thrives when it dares to be free. Which of these rule breakers would you dare to sit through? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and remember, sometimes the best films are the ones censors never wanted you to see.